joining us today. I'm really excited for this webinar because it comes at a time of uncertainty during COVID-19, where safeguarding the well-being of our children is of utmost importance for educators, parents and legislators. My name is Wendy O'Kay and I'll be facilitating the webinar. Before I introduce our two guest speakers, I think it's important to note the supports that TeachCloud is providing for early childhood educators and parents. Of course, we're running free webinars like this one, but we're also tweaking our software to meet the needs of children and their families. TeachCloud is a cloud-based management application for early childhood services. Throughout this webinar, you'll hear about the importance of relationships and open communication. At TeachCloud, we've integrated instant messaging between parents and teachers, as well as encouraging knowledge sharing regarding children's documentation, like learning stories. Of course, we have everything else you need, like digital attendance, enrollment, daily risk assessments, and daily records. Teachers really are the buffer, and at TeachCloud, we enable you as the educator to focus less on paperwork and more on the needs of children and their families. This brings me on to the webinar topic, Be the Buffer, Trauma-Sensitive Approaches to ECEC. We're really lucky today to be joined by renowned experts in trauma and play therapy in Dr. Judith Butler and Miss Julie Meighan. I'd like to give you a bit of a background on both of our speakers. Dr. Judith Butler is a researcher and lecturer in early childhood education and care at Cork Institute of Technology. Judith also supervises postgraduate research and is currently involved in trauma research. Judith's research interests also include the social domain of children's development, and in particular, social competence, relationships, and the impact of positive and adverse childhood experiences on children and their families. Judith has vast experience working with and on behalf of children. She is the editor of Online Vogue, the Irish Journal of Early Childhood Studies, and is the national president of OMEP Ireland. Judith can be contacted at judith.butler@cit.ie or on Twitter at Dr_Jude. And all of these details will be presented at the end of the presentation. Our second speaker, Julie Meighan, is a play therapist, facilitator and lecturer in drama at Cork Institute of Technology, where she lectures on the ECEC and social care degree courses. She's delivered drama workshops and training to a wide variety of academic and professional organisations worldwide. Julie runs an educational blog, dramastartbooks.com, where she writes about all aspects of drama in education. She's written several books for teachers on the subject. Her books have been translated into several languages and have sold over 50,000 copies. She has a particular interest in how play acts as a medium to assist children who have experienced trauma in their lives, and she'll be giving practical strategies for you to implement today. Julie can be found on Twitter at drama_start.
And I suppose, this really is an introduction to the science of trauma-sensitive practices. So we believe in the midst, I suppose, of COVID pandemic and lockdown and the aftermath, that we need to consider the role of adversity and trauma and subsequent traumatizing experiences in the lives of children. And that's what we're going to do today. So just as Wendy said, I lecture in CIT in the area of early childhood care and education, and particularly on the psychology modules. And if you have any questions in relation to that course, you can ask us as well in the chat. It doesn't just have to be about the content today. Julie and I are also looking at maybe designing a master's or an MA or an MEd in trauma sensitive approaches to early childhood care and education. So we're also looking for maybe feedback in relation to that. There's no such thing as a free dinner, is there? So if you can maybe put into the chat if you're interested in something, if you think that is something that that the sector would be interested in, maybe you might just put that into the chat if you can. I also want to ask you in relation to previous training that you've had, that if this was covered in your initial education practitioner training, and you might just have a little discussion in that chat as well if it was, so that we know how to pitch, I suppose, going forward if we are to come again, if Wendy will invite us on again to present. So we'll move on to the next slide there, Wendy. So the aim of this presentation, I suppose, is to highlight the need for practitioners to become trauma sensitive. And we're going to be looking at that term in relation to working with and on behalf of children in ECEC. And, you know, we're all about integrating theory into practice. That's what we do in CIT. It's all about applying. So it offers simple, practical suggestions and strategies for assisting children who've been impacted by trauma. So we know that early childhood adversity is a topic that's widely discussed, I suppose, in the literature on ECCE training programs. But what appears to be less covered and is brought to our attention quite recently is that adverse childhood experiences seem to be not discussed. And we hope that this, as a result, will be of some benefit to you. I always say to Julie, my colleague here, that, you know, as ECEC practitioners, our default is nearly trauma sensitive anyway. By our very nature being involved working with children, we appear to be trauma sensitive. It's our default. We're compassionate. So all of this, for a lot of you, is really, you know, practical, common knowledge and common sense. So we'll move on there, Wendy. It's great to have somebody to deal with the technology. So looking at toxic stress, trauma, and adversity. Okay, all these terms, right. So a toxic stress response can occur when a child experiences strong, frequent, or prolonged adversity. And the key thing is here, without adequate adult support, right? So the kind of prolonged activation of the stress response systems can disrupt the development of the brain architecture and other body systems, and increases the risk for stress-related disease and cognitive impairment and other challenges later on. So we'll move on there, Wendy, to the next one, to the 3 different types. Right, so there are a number of types of stress. So we know the positive stress is the type of stress that spurs us on and gets us through webinars, or maybe to give a presentation when we're in college, or maybe to speak to a parent who's irate or whatever. It's a brief increase in our heart rate, mild elevations in stress hormones, but we're fine. We get over it. And then there's the tolerable or bearable stress. And this stress is a little bit more serious, but luckily it's only temporary. So we're able to cope with this type of stress also because we have somebody in our lives that's supportive. So there's a key person in our lives that acts as a buffer. And then there's another type of stress, and this is the more serious one. And this is the toxic stress, another word for trauma. And this, on the other hand, is prolonged. It leads to prolonged activation of the stress response, and it occurs with, you know, the absence of protective factors. So there mightn't be a key person in our lives to support us during that difficult time. So now we're going to try and, I suppose, define what we mean exactly by trauma. So we'll move on to the next slide there, Wendy. Okay, so the origin of the word trauma is Greek for wound. It means wound. And the child should be viewed as wounded, okay? So in response to trauma or toxic stress, the brain produces cortisol. And, you know, you were aware of all of these stress hormones, adrenaline and what, you know, and cortisol, but cortisol is the primary stress hormone. So what's the fuss? Well, during prolonged exposure to stress or adversity, these cortisol levels remain too high in the brain, and they have very negative and worrying consequences. So we'll move on. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain. I won't bore you with neuroscience, but I find it fascinating. So there are a number of areas of the brain that are impacted by trauma. We're going to look at 4 of them, even though there's only 3 on the slide there. So the first one we're going to look at is the hippocampus. Yeah, and you can see it there on the screen. And this is responsible for long-term memory, paying attention and learning. And as we said, extreme stress means there's more cortisol in the system. So this can actually stop the hippocampus working. It also reduces in volume, and researchers have actually found that people who suffer from chronic trauma, for example, child abuse, or even soldiers returning from war-torn countries, the hippocampus is smaller. So as a result, people and children, particularly because their brains are just growing and developing, will have difficulty remembering information. They'll have difficulty paying attention. They'll have difficulty learning. And even, learning or getting a sense of time is quite difficult for somebody who has been impacted by trauma. So then we have the frontal cortex, as you can see there. And this is responsible for planning, memory, attention, decision-making, and reasoning. And this, integrates all parts of the brain. So again, this is another area of the brain that's impacted by trauma and can have very significant consequences. And then we have the amygdala, which you can see pointed out. This is I find this the most fascinating part of the brain. It's an almond-shaped mass in each hemisphere. So you actually have two. And it's the alarm center of the brain. And it's the most well-developed part of the brain at birth. So we're nearly wired for survival. So it's evolved, or it's involved in processing our emotions, our memories and motivation. And changes to the amygdala function can make a person more likely to triggers, react to triggers, especially emotional ones. And people can experience emotional extremes and, struggle to regulate their emotions. And of course, the key to how we process strong emotions is done here in the amygdala as well. And the last part of the brain I'm going to talk about is the brain stem, which is just at the base. And this plays a really important role in the regulation of primitive functions like breathing, blood pressure, temperature, and heart rate. All these things that are impacted when we are faced with, stressful situations. Trauma affects our ability to think. It makes us less able to learn. And this is because we are actually in survival mode. So under traumatic stress, the lower brain, which is the brain stem that I've just spoken about, predominates. And, that's why we get hot and our blood pressure rises and our heart is pounding. And it stops us, being rational and stops us being calm. We can't learn and we can't think and we can't respond appropriately. And that is why if you ever get an email or somebody says something to you that is just really stressful and really annoying, don't react, because, the logic part of your brain has just flipped. So, you can't. So go away, take some time out for yourself and come back and respond later. So understanding brain development, children's brain development, understanding child development and attachment help us to become more compassionate, because we now understand that if a child is behaving in a certain way, right, it's because of this, and not because they're bad or bold or something or challenging. We don't use that word anymore. It's because, that something has happened to them, and that's the main question, what has happened to you rather than what is wrong with you. So we'll move on there, Wendy. So as we said at the beginning, you might have discussed adversity when you were in college, when you were training in whatever, college course you did. But what is probably least well known until quite recently is adverse childhood experiences. Now, I first became aware of adverse childhood experiences when I was doing my PhD back in I'm not even going to say, but a few years ago. And these are traumatic events, right, that occur before the child is 18. So 0, and I actually even think from conception up until 17. So these are negative experiences that can happen to a child, specific negative experience that can happen to a child that impact on that child's holistic health and well-being. And the consequences, occur right throughout the lifespan. So it just isn't over when the traumatic event isn't over. When that's over, it continues right throughout the lifespan. So we know that children are especially sensitive to trauma and adversity, largely because their bodies and their brains are just developing. And we now know that there's increasing evidence that the greater the ratio of trauma, the more detrimental the impact this will be on the person throughout their lifespan. So adverse childhood experiences or childhood trauma, lead to brains, as we've seen, that are wired for fear. And as a result, the child who has been impacted by trauma behaves differently. Okay. And, it's nearly, it's nearly, that they're responding to protect themselves in this way as a result of their experiences. So we'll move on there, Wendy. So what does research say? Well, the first, the Vincent Felitti and Robert Ande and their colleagues in 1998 in the States were the guys who came up with this term adverse childhood experiences. And they literally found extensive research to say that, that trauma attacks the structures of a child's developing brain and has long-lasting effects on brain structure and function. Now, I think it was 2011, the World Health Organization recognized ACEs as a public health challenge and something we should all be aware of. So this really, has now, there's more literature and more research on it, which concurs with the original study conducted by Felitti and Ande, and which would all be in agreement that yes, these ACEs or traumatic experience occurring from, I think, conception to 17 have long-lasting consequences. So this groundbreaking research, right, identified 10 types of childhood trauma. And as I said, these affect health, well-being, education, opportunities right throughout the lifespan. So we'll just move on and look at the original 10 ACEs. Now, these can be, I suppose, subdivided into 3 groups of ACEs. So there's abuse. So we've got physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, dreadfully traumatic experiences for children. Neglect, physical neglect, emotional neglect. And then there is a third category, household dysfunction. And they would include things like the mental illness in a household, the jailing or incarceration of a relative from a household, the witnessing of domestic abuse. And the minute you say that a child has witnessed domestic abuse, I actually think the child is a victim, and I'm sure you would concur with that. And then substance misuse in a home, and divorce and bereavement. Now, as you can see, some of them we cannot, that we cannot, I suppose, prevent. We can't prevent maybe a bereavement or maybe a divorce, but we can prevent some of them, okay? And we can prevent the impact of them. So moving on. So additional ACEs have been added over the years, like things like homelessness, and as we know, it's a huge problem in this country. Bullying by other child or an adult, witness of violence outside the home, things like racism, sexism, or other discrimination, witness sibling abuse, and natural disasters or war. And maybe we could include there pandemics, So we'll move on. Just going to take a little drink. So the number. So people with high ACEs scores are more likely to, as we said, have difficulties. They're more likely to be violent. They're more likely to have broken bones. They're more likely to have drug prescriptions. They're more likely to have autoimmune diseases and loads of other things, right? Loads of challenges. Now, the key thing here to remember is that the number of categories and not the intensity or frequency that determine health outcomes. So it's the number of categories of ACEs that's important, not actually the intensity of one. Okay, or 2. It's the number. So the more you have, the more at risk the child is. So people with high ACEs scores are at risk, and we must be aware of this, right? So, and to remember again, going back that, people with ACEs, we know that the research suggests that they're more likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to drop out of school. They're more likely to end up using, homeless services or etc. So, and it's important to remember that, the trauma isn't over when it's over. It has long-lasting consequences. And that's the thing to remember here. So we'll move on. So how common? And, this upsets me because it's quite, very unfortunately common. ACEs are common. And some, as we said, cannot be prevented. And in the general population, many of us will have experienced at least one ACE, It's widely acknowledged that trauma doesn't discriminate. It occurs across all racial, cultural, and economic groups. And it can happen to any child. A very interesting lady by the name of Lisa Cherry, if you're not following her on social media platforms or on YouTube, maybe consider that. She's a trauma expert in the UK, and she explains that in a typical classroom of 30 children, 8 will have a parent with a mental health condition. 1 child will be caring for a parent or sibling. 2 will be living in homes where there's domestic violence or abuse. 1 will be living with severe deprivation, and 3 with relatively serious mental health conditions themselves. Now that's alarming. That's a typical classroom of 30 children. The Children's Rights Alliance here in this country tells us that there are over 100,000 children living in poverty in Ireland. And when you put that in context, 100,000 children, that equates to the populations of Waterford, Drogheda and Sligo, right? That's if you're not from Ireland and you don't know Waterford, Drogheda and Sligo, they're big counties. But so when children grow up poor, we know, right, that they face challenges that they shouldn't have to face. Homelessness, food poverty, lack of opportunities, and life for children living in poverty is extremely tough. And again, over the last few weeks in the UK, I've only stats for the UK, unfortunately, that the NSPCC, I'm sure they can be replicated here. The NSPCC in the UK have reported that there's a 22% increase in calls by children relating to abuse since lockdown. And these calls appear to be mostly about parental alcohol or substance abuse. So children who do not have safe homes and secure attachments to key people, and I'm going to come back to that term in a while, are going to return to our settings, in more difficulty than before. Okay, we know that connection is a biological need, and that's what we're going to try and aim for. So we'll move on, Wendy. Okay, so what can ACEs look like? Okay, trauma is a wound. It has symptoms, it has signs, and these are them, And early humans, were exposed to the constant threat of being killed or injured by wild animals and tribes, which we know. So the chances of survival, to improve the chances of survival, we went into the flight or fright or response mode, and that evolved over the years. So when we're frightened, the amygdala automatically activates this fight or flight mode. So children who have ACEs, right? They can go into one of these or all of these modes. So they could be in a fight mode, and a fight mode might be yelling or screaming or destroying property or kicking or any of those behaviors. Or flight mode might be, they might run away or cover their hand in their head, cover a head with their hands, or hide under blankets. Or a little guy in my class a number of years ago, he was hiding under the table, under the desk, for about, I'd say, 6 weeks until he felt safe and secure with me. Or the freeze mode, the child might be tired, exhausted from being overwhelmed by the stress and the trauma. They might be lethargic, they might be daydreaming, engaging in repetitive movements, or, fixated on maybe self-injury or something like that, okay? So watch for signs of trauma in the next month or two. Usually after trauma, in the first month, a child seems to be okay. And it's common for them to be okay, but after maybe about a month, the numbness nearly wears off. And children might experience more symptoms. And, particularly for children who might have experienced, the loss of a loved one, or maybe worrying about the loss of their parent, the loss of their parent's job or something like that. So to be mindful of that. So, fight and flight are an automatic response to children who have encountered stress. So to be aware of that. So what was really interesting, I read an article recently, was that after the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, children in a nearby kindergarten started playing dead. They were pretending to be dead in their play. And the teacher was monitoring this for a while. And when she asked the children to tell her what was happening, or when their teacher asked them to tell her what was happening in their play, they told her that they were being killed by terrorists. Okay, and this play went on and on and on. And the teacher decided, well, they're nearly stuck in their play, because they were smashing towers and things like that. So she decided she would have to change or maybe direct or coax the narrative. So she intervened and she said to the children, in a developmentally appropriate way, of course, if they'd be interested in developing or building a hospital. So she got stethoscopes and masks and bandages and all the other stuff that you would need for a hospital. And the focus was on healing and care. So she expertly handled the transition. So the children were nearly stuck and needed help in their play to come to terms with this extremely traumatic event. So the teacher didn't judge, or tell them, stop, you can't be playing like that, come over, She understood that this was that they nearly needed to do this, that they were able to act out their anxieties and fears through the process of play. But, she expertly, redirected the play. She coaxed the narrative, as I said, in a new direction. And play, and we're all experts on play. Play has the power to make something tolerable or even unhappen. And it allowed these children to connect or to correct something that was very overwhelming. So very traumatized children may not play. Okay, so if you have children come back to your settings who may not play, that is a concern. The absence of play is concerning. But we must remember that children will need a sense of safety, okay, first, before they will play. So, the child who comes to your setting in the morning who's clinging to their mom and they don't want her to go, until they feel safe, they won't be able to make that transition from mom to you. So, we must nurture that, of course. And I know that you're all experts at doing that. So we must be the buffer. So we'll move on there. So, and I'm going to be finishing after this slide, I think. It's on to Wendy. Or sorry, it's not, it's on to Julie. So survival mode in a dangerous world. So young children who experience trauma, okay, this is all I can say, is that they see the world as a dangerous place. Their stress response system is continually activated, communicating to them that they're not safe. So we must make them safe. And we make them safe through building connections with them and promoting relationships. So survival mode for the traumatized child can involve very difficult behavior. And we're not going to say challenging, because we think, first of all, challenging behavior has, been misinterpreted throughout the years, I think. Challenging behavior is anything that's done at the excess that interferes with a child's development and learning. That's fine, right? But these children, are reacting because of something that has happened to them. So the behavior is a symptom of the problem, and any outbursts or difficult, challenging or strong emotions must be understood as reflexive attempts made by the child to feel safe in what they perceive as a dangerous world. I think I am moving on to Julie. Am I, Julie?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, and I'm going to mute.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about is protective factors and how we can introduce protective factors in earlier settings. But before I talk about protective factors, I need to briefly explain risk factors of trauma. So a risk factor can be defined as variables that increase an individual's likelihood of a negative developmental or life outcome. So there are three types of risk factors. They're individual attributes. So examples of this would be low self-esteem, cognitive or emotional difficulties, difficulties in communication, and in adolescence or adulthood, it could look like substance abuse or medical illness. The second type is social circumstances. So examples of that could be loneliness, bereavement, neglect, family conflict, exposure to violence, abuse, difficulties or failure at school. And it could look like work stress or unemployment in adulthood. So that's some examples of it. And the third kind is environmental factors. So examples of that are poor access to basic services, injustice or discrimination, social and gender inequalities, and exposure to war. And what's actually very current at the moment is exposure to a pandemic would be considered an environmental factor. So what a protective factor then is, there are circumstances that work to negate the effect of trauma or ACEs. And protective factors are the building blocks of resilience. So we move on to the next slide. We can see, I'll show you examples of protective factors and what we can do to actually implement them. So again, there are three kinds of protective factors. There are individual attributes, social circumstances, and environmental factors. So examples of individual attributes would be high level of self-esteem and self-confidence, ability to solve problems, manage stress or adversity, good coping skills, good communication skills, good physical health, or good level of fitnesses. Now, these are all traits and skills that a trauma-sensitive environment in earlier settings would help to promote in children. Then social circumstances, again, so social circumstance protective factors, examples of that would be good social support from family and outside of the family, example, peers and educators, physical security and safety, both inside and outside the home, positive relationships, both inside and outside the home, and academic achievement. Now, the ECEC practitioner could and maybe should have a large role to play in putting social circumstances, protective factors in place. So you need or should create strong, positive relationships between you and the children and promote positive relationships between the children in your care. So a few examples I'm just going to say of environmental factors would be equality to basic services, social justice, tolerance, integration, social and gender equality, physical security, and safety outside the home. So again, safety outside the home is an environmental protective factor that you could put in place. So I'm just going to switch back over to Judith, I think. There.
Yes, back
yeah,
to you.
Yeah, back to you.
Okay. Yeah. So, and I was reading some fantastic questions there, so I can't wait to answer those, and it'd be lovely to have an open forum where people could respond back. But anyway, so what do we need? Okay, so we need a trauma-sensitive approach. Okay, and as I said at the beginning, this is nearly our default in early childhood care and education. Anyway, particularly with our fantastic frameworks that we have, Shielta and Astra. But this refers to how centres think about and respond to children and their families who've experienced trauma. I don't know if you've ever been, in need of something, or you needed a question answered, and you had to ring somebody looking for an answer, and the person at the end of the phone wasn't very nice, and it made the whole situation, worse. Being trauma informed would mean that everyone that you're dealing with is understanding that, everyone's fighting a battle that nobody knows, and that, from the bus driver to the canteen people, to the person working, in the doctor's surgery, to the teachers in the school, that everybody's aware of that, and that everyone is treated with compassion. Wouldn't that just be the ideal world? But anyway, for many of us, as I said, working in ECCE, this is our default setting anyway. We're always understanding, we're always kind. Kindness is the most underrated trait in the world. So the primary factor in recovering from trauma for children, right, is relationships. So the primary factor in recovering from a traumatic event is the presence of a supportive, caring adult in a child's life. Now, even when the parent is not available, children benefit greatly from key people in their lives. Now, this key person approach, early years educators, you will be aware of this. It was developed by Eleanor Goldsmith, who also developed the treasure basket, big fan of that, and heuristic learning, so discovery learning, big fan of that as well. And Eleanor said she was really, stressed that the key person should be called that. They're key people. They're not key workers. You're a key person in the child's life. And, sometimes we hear, say, oh, there's a key worker system. We want to get rid of that as well. We want to call it key person. We all have key people in our lives that we love, and that we know that we're safe and we're with them. And for the child, this is what we want. We want key people around them. Okay, so this key person approach, as I said, developed by Eleanor Goldsmith, offers consistent, sensitive care that helps children feel safe and protected. Now, in earlier settings, we kind of always follow that. Sometimes there might even be the looping system where the key person moves on to the next stage with the child, or with the class, or a class group or a preschool group, but play pods, by their very nature, when I heard about them, I thought, wow, these could be very soothing, for children, by building relationships with key people. And we know that resilience, we're always hearing about resilience. Oh, we must be resilient. Resilience only comes from close relationships, So resilience will only come from close, responsive, loving, caring, relationships. And we know that any cooperation can only come from connection as well. So am I still on? I'm still on. Next slide. So what does a trauma-sensitive approach mean? It means understanding three things. It means understanding the prevalence of ACEs, understanding ACEs, adverse child experience, what they are and the prevalence of them. They're common, and it means understanding the role trauma plays in people's lives. It really impacts us, and most importantly, it understands that any healing from trauma can only come from responsive relationships with key people. So what is essential is who helps to buffer that impact. And ECEC practitioners like us can be that buffer. So we want children, and we'll just move on to the next slide, Wendy. We want children to believe that I am seen, I'm heard, and I'm loved. Others are predictable and caring, and the world is good and safe. Because for many children, they come to us from homes where they don't feel that, okay? Or they don't feel their world is predictable or consistent, where there is no, kind word, or there is no smile. So how do we do this? And we'll just move on to that, next one. So for anyone who, and I can see some of the names there that I have taught some of the people who are participants, and I don't know why you'd want to come on and listen to us again on a Saturday. But anyway, you know that I am a big fan of Meighan Pringle, and she was around in the 70s. And, Meighan Pringle said there were 4 fundamental needs of children: love and security, praise and recognition, new experiences, and responsibility. I live my life, like, when I'm thinking about children, I think of those. I live my education life around those. And, love and security, for example, we want to make the child feel calm. So we must act calm, even in these crazy times where we're, washing our hands more, or we were always very good in early years education, sanitizing and washing our hands, but washing our environments more and whatever else, we must act calm. So children look to adults for reassurance after traumatic events. So we obviously don't discuss our anxieties with children or even with our colleagues while children are there, because, fabulous ears that are listening, be aware of your tone of voice. Our tone of voice can be very soothing, or it can't be. And children quickly pick up on our anxiety. Maintain routines as much as possible. Transitions and routines are really, so important during these, crazy times. So amidst the chaos and the change, routines, reassure children that life is going to be okay again. And, we're aiming for trauma reducing rather than trauma inducing learning environments. So keep asking yourself, any interactions that I have with the child, am I making a connection? And that's what we're aiming for. Responsibility, according to Meighan Pringle, is one of the fundamental needs of children. And again, it's not, giving children responsibility of things that are, developmentally not right. We're talking about offering children simple choice in their lives. Do you want to play with this, or do you want to play with that? Do you want your milk out of your blue cup or your red cup? And at home, do you want to wear your green socks or your white socks? Simple controlled choices are very empowering. And I suppose for all, we as adults, we like order in our lives, but children need order in their lives. But it's nice to have choice, because we are empowered. It's really empowering to offer children different ways, I suppose, of asserting their independence, just such as giving them choice. So will I move on? Yes. Oh, so this back one more, Wendy. Sorry. Yeah. So I saw a question coming in there, and I know I'm not supposed to be answering them, but somebody asked, what about children in creches? How can we, work with children who have been trauma impacted in creches? Well, for all children, face-to-face interactions are essential, all right? Again, as I said, the tone of our voice, our gestures, we used to call it mother ease, parent ease, short, simple sentences with our tone of voice goes up and down. You know how it is. Always greet every child you meet, whether it's your own child or whether it's a child in the street, or whether it's a child in your classroom or in your setting or whatever, with a smile. Always greet a child with a smile. Be happy to see them. Yours might be the only smile they see that day. Be kinder than you have to. Kindness is so important. When people are more kind than they have to, you're nearly blown away away. And it's such, a lovely trait to have. Now, with our babies, respond consistently to our babies' needs. Now, we know with our little babies 0 to 1 that the developmental task of babies really is to trust caregivers, so children can develop a strong, healthy attachment. Serve and return engagement is essential. I even use it with older children. Serve and return, it's like the volleyball or the tennis. So, that's to and fro. I say something and then I pick up on the child's responses and then I reply. And this is all promoting brain development and brain architecture. So smile at your babies, of course. Research shows that eye contact, touch, and simply being in a caregiver's presence helps the baby's emotions to stay balanced. It soothes their amygdalas. So yeah, is this me?
I think, no, this is me, is it?
Yeah, you too.
Okay, and you can hear me fine? Okay, so basically things that we can consider straight away is ask, offer, be. So ask, what happened to the child, rather than what's wrong with the child. So ask the child themselves what happened instead of what's wrong. Offer simple choice whenever you can, and be sensitive to the cues in the environment that may cause a reaction in the traumatized child. So an example of this may be weekends where higher alcohol consumption in the home, and there might be more domestic violence. So in order for us to implement a trauma-sensitive environment and put protective factors in place, we must remember 4 things. All right, the first thing is we need to focus on relationships, as this will help the child experience secure and positive relationships. They may not have experienced that at home. The second thing is we need to provide safety and trustworthiness. This will help them feel secure, and this is particularly important for children who may live in an unsafe environment. Engage in choice and collaboration is the third one, which helps build confidence, improve communication skills, and promotes healthy peer relationships. Encourage skill building and confidence. This helps with problem-solving skills, promotes imagination, improves cognitive and emotional skills. So if we move on to the next slide. We're going to talk about simple strategies that we can do straight away, that maybe you can take from this presentation today and maybe implement them on Monday. So always have a welcoming environment. So always have colorful, positive signages. Greet the children by name daily. Again, as Judith said, your tone of voice and gestures are very important because they're all cues of safety and danger for a child. And as she said as well, always greet a child with a smile. And well, what we could do as well is ask the child what type of greeting that they might like. So for example, you could have a chart outside the room with pictures of different types of greetings, like you can have high five or fist bump or wave, and they can just point to the greeting that they want on the way in that day. So again, another thing that Judith said that's really important is predictability. Predictability is very important for all children, not just a traumatized child. But so we must have clear and consistent routines and communicate very clear boundaries. And also, it's very important to have well-organized space, clearly defined areas. And we must remember as well, a child's developing brain is not suited to handling stress and negative emotions. So it's very important in any early years room to create a specific space which is comfortable, quiet, and safe, where children can retreat if they feel overwhelmed. So we can call this a time in rather than a time out. So another really important thing that we can implement straight away is predictable transitions. So we can build routine around transitions. We can use things like music or a bell for the transitions. We can post daily schedules. And some transitions may be particularly difficult for children who have a trauma history. So transitions like beginning or the end of the day, horizontal transitions, moving from one activity to another, end of year transitions, which are vertical transitions. So if they're moving on from the toddler group to the preschool group, or moving from preschool to junior infants. So for children who've experienced trauma, talking about the future can be very difficult. Another thing we can do in relation to behavior is recognize behavior publicly, but guide behavior privately. And again, always in a calm voice. And try to catch the children doing good and recognize, have positive recognition. Another thing is important to remember too are the days and dates or holidays that might be fun for a lot of us or for many children can be difficult for children who've experienced trauma. So as I mentioned previously, we need to be sensitive to their environment. So as I said, I gave an example earlier on about weekends may signal higher alcohol consumption in the home or more domestic violence. So they mightn't be looking forward to the weekend as much as other children. Other things we can do straight away is ask the children about their interests and their strengths, praise a specific skill and not just say very good job, increase opportunities for fun and humor, and use cooperative learning strategies as much as possible. and also promote collaborative, positive problem solving. So if we just move on to the next slide. Okay, so in the PDF file that you got, there's some ideas that you can use, activities and strategies and ideas that you can use for self-regulation. And the couple of some of the things that you can use, like for example, mindfulness. So what we can think when we talk about mindfulness with children, we can say for very young children that it takes a lot of concentration and focus, and they wouldn't be able to do it, and it's pointless. But you can use very simple techniques. So an example of one would be get one of those pinwheels and just get them to blow on them and just focus on the wheel going around and around. Another mindfulness activity that they really, really enjoy is buddy breathing. And this is where they get their favorite cuddly toy and they lie on the ground and they put their favorite cuddly toy on their tummy. And what they do is they just breathe in and out. And all they have to do is focus on the cuddly toy going up and down, up and down. Yoga is another very good thing that you can use with children, and using different yoga poses. And it's a fun way for imagining. Yoga has loads of animal poses, so they can it's fun and imaginative, and they get into the different poses. So there's like downward dog and cobra and the frog and the crow. So again, in the PDF file there's a link to some resources that where you can get different yoga poses. Another thing is feeling boards. Again, this can be very, very useful, particularly in this time. So what you can do is make a board and have the child's picture on the board, or the children in your class, or the children in the room, and they can come in every day and they can get an emoji or a sticker that represents how they feel. So again, they don't need to tell you how they feel, they're just showing you. And another effective thing that you could use in this time as well is create a calm down box or a comfort box. And this is a little box where you can put in the children's favorite things and help them if they're anxious, and help them to calm down or to feel comfort. So things you could put in this box are bubbles, a kaleidoscope, pictures of their family, fidget spinners, weighted blanket, their favorite snack, a stress ball. So what's good about this is each child's comfort box will be different. Again, another effective technique or strategy you can use are relaxation activities. So again, these are very effective for making transitions, horizontal transitions, and maybe transitions at the beginning or the end of the day. So an example of this, again, they're in the PDF file, but an example of a relaxation exercise that you could do is get the children to lie on the floor and imagine they're a four-pointed star and they're shining brightly in the sky, and then the star collapses. And do this 2 or 3 times and the children become very relaxed. So other things that we can use is art, and art is very effective because young children have difficulty expressing their conscious thoughts and feelings. And this is due to their lack of vocabulary and limited abstract thinking. So art materials facilitates the child's self-expression as it externally conveys their problem or situation. So as Wendy mentioned earlier, I'm particularly interested in clay, and I've used it a lot in my play therapy practice. And I find a particularly beneficial material as it's very cathartic in nature. But again, when I talk about clay here, and I've put some examples of activities you can use with the clay, but you can also use Play-Doh, and you can use City Putty and Modern Magic, and there's plenty of Play-Doh recipes, so you can make homemade Play-Doh. So it's very effective when children feel frozen, angry, or overwhelmed by life challenges to use this. So some children find the clay soothing, and it can be used for releasing tension. Others use it as a safe outlet to express frustration and aggression. But it's important though, if you're using something like clay or Play-Doh for emotional release, it's always very important for the practitioner to stay with the child while they're using it. Another thing, young children, as I said, do not have the vocabulary or the abstract thinking ability to verbally express their inner world. So they can readily express their thoughts, feelings, wants and needs through their natural medium of expression, which is play.
So when we're speaking to children, of course, we spoke about the importance of our tone of voice and how we ask questions. So, children will come back to our services and they will have some anxiety. Some of them will have anxiety, some more than others. So, you know, we don't say things to children like, you've nothing to be worried about. Come on, you're grand, come in. So instead we say things like, it's normal to feel worry. You know, it is normal to feel worry. We all feel a little bit overwhelmed, I think. You know, we don't say things like, this will be over soon, because we don't know when we will be back to normal, you know, and it might take a number of years, as we know. So instead we might say, this might take a while, but what can we do to make today a good day? And then we would say things like, don't worry, everything will be fine. Because, you know, we can't just say and dismiss the child's feelings, but instead we say, this might be hard for you. I understand, you know, and what can I do to make it better for you? So I promise you won't get in. You'll be ill. You'll be fine. Go into preschool. You'll be fine. We can't say that. So we can do lots of things to ensure that we won't get ill. So washing our hands and taking very good care of ourselves can help us all stay very healthy. So just to rephrase and to remember that every interaction, as Karen Trisman says, every interaction that we have with children is an intervention. So that, you know, that every interaction that I'm having with a child who might be presenting with some, you know, anxiety or being overwhelmed or whatever, that I must ask myself, is what I'm saying to this child, is this going to ensure that I'm connected to this child and not, you know, disconnecting from the child? Okay, will I move on, Wendy? Okay, so as we said, all healing comes from relationships. You know, we talk about the 3 R's, you know, reading, writing, and arithmetic. I think let's put them to the side and let's interpret the 3 R's as relationships, relationships, relationships. And these should be interpreted with the 3 A's, as Marian Dowling in her lovely book says: acceptance, affection, and approval. And somebody asked there in the chat box that I was reading while Julie was speaking, you know, is it okay to pick children up and, you know, to comfort them like that? It is okay. Touch is very powerful. And of course, you know, soothing children, you know, is very powerful. And to feel secure and safe, that's what, you know, children need.
It's like as adults to feel dismissed, invalidated, not listened to. And but as adults, sometimes, well, most of the time, we have coping strategies to deal with that. But if a child feels dismissed, they feel dismissed. If they feel they're not being listened to, that's what they feel. And if they feel they're invalidated, their points are, then they're not acknowledged. That's actually how they feel. So what is very important there is, as Judith just probably said, is how we speak and the language we use, and also the tone of voice, and also to make sure that we speak in a calm voice as well. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that. Where did you get to?
Yeah, I went through the 3 R's and the acceptance relate. Yeah, so you can take on from here now.
Yeah, okay, so sorry about that.
No.
So this is every action is an intervention, and this comes from Dr. Karen Trisman. And I don't know, some of you might have gone to some of her training inside in the City Hall in January, and she did some training in 2018 as well, I think, or 2019, last year. And it all comes as well. She was doing the training as part of to make Cork a sensitive, trauma sensitive city. So Judith is actually on the steering committee for that. So she if you want to find out about that, you can contact her at the end. We give you our details. All right. And what is actually important, I think, as well for that is it's important for practitioners to develop their active listening skills, demonstrate empathy, and be non-judgmental with the children in their care. So moving on there. So we need to reflect in our own practice and ensure that all children feel welcome and accepted and valued, and each step of the learning process should be cheered and celebrated. So what does all this add up to? Which is the next slide. So this is just a quote here that is very apt, I think. And it's extraordinary to me that in the last 15 years of brain research, all of those billions of dollars spent in laboratories have shown to me one single important message. It can be best set out as follows. If a child in an environment where they are understood as an individual human being, then their self-esteem will be improved. And if their self-esteem is good, they will gain self-confidence. if they're in an environment where the self-esteem is good and they have self-confidence, they will feel engaged in the environment. And what does all that add up to? Well, love as it happens. So as educators, we have a responsibility to impart professional love to children in our care. And this professional love was a term coined by Jules Page. And I just want to say as well, like that self-esteem and self-confidence and self-worth are very important internal factors, protective factors. So even though you might have children that come from safe environments and being in your care and to be safe in your care and whatever, if you promote all this in the early years, and even though the children mightn't have had any trauma, as we get older, we all experience different types of trauma, and none of us will get through our lives without experiencing trauma. So having a good sense of self-worth and a good level of self-esteem and self-confidence, they will help to help us combat adversity in later life as well. So, and the other thing too about the relationships, why they're very important too. So a child might come from a very loving family and have very secure relationships. They go to the creche, they have very secure relationships there. They go to school, they have meaningful participation, secure relationships. And then what will happen when they get to adulthood? They're far less likely to get involved in dysfunctional adult relationships, or if they do, they will leave it straight away because they'll know that it's not quite right. Okay, so the next slide. So that's just the end of it really, but the trauma is not what happens to us, but how much it impacts us. So we need to be the buffer. And the next one is, we are very social.
It's time now to thank Julie and Judith so much for presenting to us. We'll now be moving to the question and answer segment, and we're showing some of the references and also useful resources. We've also sent a PDF to all of the webinar attendees that has practical strategies on supporting children and trauma. We've also left some of our social media handles and emails. So if you do have any questions that arise after this webinar, please feel free to contact us. So that's for Dr. Judith Butler, at Dr_Jude on Twitter. Julie is also on Twitter at drama_start. And TeachCloud can be found everywhere. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Was from Kate, who said, regarding a child's behaviour, what is the best or most effective way of disciplining a trauma-impacted child?
Yes, yeah, so I'll take that one. I suppose we kind of, Julie and I aren't fans again. We're getting rid of some terminology. We're not fans of the word discipline anymore. You know, it used to, we're certainly not fans of the word punishment, but we're not fans of the word discipline anymore. Discipline comes from the word disciple, follower, or pupil. But we prefer to say that we guide children's behaviour now rather than disciplining them. So I'm just going to take an example here. So we just say, for example, a child who has bit another child, you know, and in the past, we might have put that child on the timeout chair or the thinking chair or the bold chair. And when I was a child going to school, or the bold corner. And we used to do that, and we did that just assuming that the child, you know, was bold. But we now know that there's no such thing as a bold child, and that all behaviour is communication, and that there might have been a number of triggers for that response. So the child might be hungry, they might be tired, they might be sleepy, they might be whatever, they might have encountered something at home last night that was quite worrying. There are 100 different stressors that might have made the child to act in that way. So in other words, something in the child's environment is influencing the way they behave. So instead of pointing out what the child did wrong and shaming them and putting them on the bold chair or in the corner or whatever, show them how to set things right. So this is guiding children's behaviour. So let's consider the best case first, where you catch a child, as Julie said, catch them being good, you know, before they actually bite or kick or whatever. So instead of saying don't hit or no biting, try saying something like, you know, use your words, right? Because if I say don't hit or no biting, it's not giving them an alternative to do something else, and they might just revert back to the original plan of biting. Okay, so without this knowledge, you know, the child doesn't know what to do. Okay, so, you know, we need to give them an alternative. Now, on the other hand, if you catch a child after an incident, you know, and they've bit or they've done something that we didn't like, so you might say something like, you know, that was not a good choice. You know, we don't bite our friends. Would you like to say sorry to Tom? Now, the child at that stage might say, no, I don't want to say sorry. We've all met children like that. No, I don't want to say sorry. And they're not sorry at that stage, right? So there's no point in saying, well, you have to say sorry. There's no point, because the child hasn't regulated. Their amygdala hasn't calmed down yet to want to say sorry. So in that instance, I would say to the children in my class, you know, well, until we are ready to say sorry, let's sit here and read this book, right? That's not reinforcing, right? We're kind of getting rid of the behaviorism anyway. So because for a child who's been impacted by trauma, right, we must ensure that any dealings with this child, you know, that I am still connected to that child. We must avoid actions or responses that frighten or hurt or dismiss the child, right? We must ensure that we stay connected. So remember, the child needs time to regulate their emotions and allows their amygdala to calm down. So remember that we must stay connected with the child while they do that. And then we respond favorably. Now, that's just a very simple answer to that question, Kate. But we're going to guide children's behaviour from now on. Okay, guide, and, you know, rather than discipline children. And I think some of the TV programs over the years haven't really been favourable to us. So we need to try and change that mindset in relation to how we guide and manage children's behaviour. I hope I've answered you, Kate. Long-winded.
Another question was, is ADHD trauma?
Yeah,
some of the symptoms you mentioned sound like ADHD.
Yes, and I saw that question coming in there too, and I just jotted a few notes as Julie was talking. So is ADHD just trauma? And some of the symptoms sound like trauma. Right, first of all, there is a striking resemblance, yes, to some of the symptoms of ADHD. We know that there are 3 core symptoms of ADHD: inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity, right? And there are also other symptoms, like a child can have thirst, you know, so I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So it has been reported that children who have been exposed to traumatic childhood experiences can display behaviours that are actually similar to these, to you know, ADHD. But we must remember that ADHD is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders. It is a specific disorder. Some children may be misdiagnosed with ADHD, I do believe. And this is why it's important to become trauma informed and trauma aware, you know. But just remember, yes, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Some of the symptoms, yes, can be like a child who has trauma, but one does not cause the other. Okay, and just to say about I was saying that children with ADHD can have an abnormal thirst, and that's interesting, because we know that even drinking a glass of water is another simple strategy that we can do to calm the amygdala, right? Again, if you have children in your class who are displaying behaviours that are, you know, as a result of trauma, getting them to do simple things there and then, like blowing the candles out in their fingertips. If anybody saw me now, you're all looking at me thinking, this one is, what is she doing? But blowing the candles out on your fingertips soothes the amygdala, just like chewing gum and things. So simple strategies. Okay, does that answer that, Wendy?
That's a very interesting question. And we have a really, really interesting question here from Tammy, who says, what do you feel is the best way to alert all within the setting regarding a particular child's need or concerns you have? Currently, we mentioned them in a weekly meeting report. Myself, as a special education needs straight away to take any action straight away, then mention what's going on at the weekly meeting while observing confidentiality.
Well, I think you've answered your question there, you know, that maintaining confidentiality is paramount here. But as our work as teachers and practitioners working in early years education settings, we hear and see things about children's lives and their families that must be maintained in confidence and only for discussion with the team. So I would think on a needs must basis, but, you know, certainly you know, that if there are things going on in a child's life that are impacting on their development, learning, behaviour, minds, brains, you know, that it's important that that information is shared within reason with just the team. And Julie, would you like to come in there?
No, I just said what you say. My microphone's on. Just what you say is important. Confidentiality is key.
Yeah,
and
I think the person,
and she seems to be doing the right thing.
Yeah, the person has actually answered their own question.
I think sometimes that we feel that that we're not doing the right thing, or I hope today actually a lot of the stuff that we said today, and even the things that I talked about in the strategies and that you'll see in the PDF file, that it will help you maybe to reconfirm that you are on the right track, and that we are, and the whole title of this presentation was Be the Buffer, but the majority of us are. You know, we are, I mean, it's a default, as you say. We are usually early years educators. They don't get into it for the money or the career prospects, so they get into it because they're empathetic, compassionate individuals, and they want to do the best for the children in their care. So I hope this has helped you see that we've had to see that that you're on the right track.
Yeah.
Another interesting question, I think it's coming from Oklahoma, but it says, as in Oklahoma bombing kindergarten case, how long would you allow traumatic play to go on before you intervene and direct it into positive or healing play? I think it's important for children to play out their feelings and emotions for as long as they feel the need for, but just to know, especially in the COVID-19 term, when children return back to school.
I actually, sorry, do you want to,
I want you to come in and talk about maybe therapeutic stories there, Julie,
Yeah.
but I'm just going to say, again, I think that person has answered their question. You know, until the child is ready to move on in their play, if they want to repeat the same play, you know, that's fine. We can extend the children's play through our questioning, you know, our questions, our appropriate questions, and extend their language development and all that to our questions. But if the children want to play that over and over and over again until they're ready to move on, and some might be ready to move on sooner than others, that's fine. We're child-led and emergent curriculum. Julie?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I saw that question too, and I thought it was very interesting, because when Judith was mentioning it in her presentation, it reminded me of when I first started teaching, and I was teaching drama, because originally I was a drama teacher, and September 11 happened, and the children, because I was teaching drama, so there was a lot of improvisation and role playing going on, it was just constantly coming up in their role play, and they were young children, like they were 5, 6, 7, and I remember one class, they were actual twins, so they used to make them the twin towers and fly into them. And I actually, what I remember at the time was, I knew this was very important, that they needed to do this, but I didn't have the training or the awareness maybe of what to do or how to extend it, but I actually knew when it was happening that this is what they needed to do, and they needed to get this out. So I think just what Judith did say there is that some children are ready to move on before others, and just be aware of that. And you can use things like therapeutic stories as well, so we use a lot of metaphor and everything. Again, in the PDF file, there are links to therapeutic stories, and there are links to resources that you can get about making therapeutic stories for the children in your care, so you can specifically make them for them. Okay. Yeah, sorry, that's all I wanted to say.
I have another question there. I wish I could respond to the answers because they're really good, but I also want to get through because we have a lot of questions. So there's another one here, and it's quite a simple question. It says, how would you deal with social anxiety in children of any age?
Julie, do you want to take that one as a play therapist?
Yeah. So again, it's a lot of what we said in the presentation as well. There are the strategies you can use, but what's really important, that you listen to the children and you acknowledge their anxiety, and you try and reassure them. And again, put in place mindfulness strategies, relaxation, breathing strategies. All these things can be put in place, and it can be used for everyone in the class, not just the child with anxiety.
Exactly. And just to say that, you know, social anxiety is quite a common thing that can happen to children. And just to maybe identify, or to make sure that you have a very good connection with the child, find common ground with the child.
And that's basically what a lot of our presentation today was about. Well, the main thing was about is the actual relationship, and positive, influential relationships that you should have with the children.
And respect the child's temperament too.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you can have, you know, quietly confident children. There's nothing wrong with that, you know, but we must respect the child's temperament.
And just another question here. We've been hearing about the rise in mental health for adults. So somebody's asked, do you suspect a rise in mental health issues as very young children try to process the current issues?
I think they could possibly happen. I think this is a preventative measure by becoming trauma sensitive, and, you know, being the buffer, so that, you know, that we are going to buffer any anxieties or any fears or whatever the children have.
Well, we'll try to anyway.
Yeah, we will. And to remember, you know, that we're so skilled. Early years educators are so skilled in our play. You know, the way we play, the way we work with children, and to use play as a process to do that.
Somebody's asked here, and it's a question that definitely comes up a lot. So what's the best approach when broaching the subject of childhood trauma with parents and guardians?
Well, you know, children will use, our parents, you probably first see and hear things about children, and you might hear it from the parents, so they're telling you about it. Or if you spot things, then, you know, you say to the parents, and you're used to doing that. So it's not anything different from disclosing or telling them, you know, other difficulties that you're used to dealing with. But, you know, so it depends on what the ACE or what the trauma is, or what, you know, the difficulty is. So can you just repeat the question again, just to make sure I have it answered?
So what's the best approach when broaching the subject of childhood trauma with parents or guardians?
Okay, so I mean, it depends on what, you know, the situation is. Does the child have trauma and you want to talk to the parents about it, or, you know, do you just want to tell the parents about trauma? So it's difficult to answer that question, really.
Can I just say about that too, is what sometimes we actually can't broach the subject with the parents, or whatever the situation might be, or something that sometimes there's nothing the parents can do. But so all we're in control of is what relationship we have with that child at that time, and to have a positive relationship with that child. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah,
so,
that's exactly,
yeah.
But
that's what you can be in control of.
Yes.
You can try other things, but that's what you can be in control of. Yeah.
That's excellent, Julie. Yeah, exactly. And it's unless you're in that situation, if a parent is telling you about a trauma, then you handle it differently from whether, you know, you're talking about trauma in general. You don't really do that anyway, you know. So yeah, we have control over building and maintaining responsive relationships.
And I think as well, if you're talking to parents about concerns that you may have, and I'm sure majority of you do this anyway, majority of parents have the best interest of their child at heart. So how you broach it too, it has to be sensitive, and be aware of that. So 99%, I would say 95% of parents, no matter what goes on, really have the best interest of their children at heart.
Yeah, I was just going to come out and say a lot of people are kind of say, how do I talk to parents about this? I think the main thing, and both Julie and Judith said it, was approach everything with kindness. You know, you're not accusing them of everything.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah,
you know, it's just
that's what we were trying to say. Thanks, Wendy.
So I have another question here, and it's from Tammy, and she says, in your experience, do children who are overly friendly / seeking adult attention may be a cause for concerns in terms of ACEs? By this I mean the safeguarding issues surrounding children who don't understand classroom boundaries, or who seek inappropriate adult contact, such as constantly sitting on, you know, an adult's lap.
Julie, do you want to take this one?
So it depends. It depends on the situation. It depends on the child. The child just could be around a lot of adult contact. They might be an only child. So it depends. So you have to take it situation by situation, I would think. So yeah,
yeah, and you know, relationship seeking. That child is relationship seeking. You know what? You know.
So there's.
So you know, try and do maintain that connection with the child. Obviously, if a child wants to sit in your lap 24/7 in the ECEC environment, that can't happen, because the other children will want to do it.
I think when you're talking about, you should have put like clear boundaries in, and they'll end up respecting that. Do you know what I mean? So you have to be clear with your boundaries. Again, you can do that inside the setting. You mightn't have any control of that outside the setting, but that's what you can do inside the setting. So they can experience that inside the setting. So once they've experienced something, they know what it looks like, it feels like.
And routines and things become predictable.
Well, yeah.
I think it's also important to note that like we're early childhood practitioners, so also like we're not here to diagnose children either. And as Julie's saying, it's really about your relationship with that child. So, you know, I don't want people going from this and kind of going and putting labels on children either.
Yeah, and exactly. And it's just, we've given some of the symptoms, but if you a child in your care that exhibits some of the symptoms, doesn't mean that they have ACEs or trauma.
No.
Do you know what I mean?
We're talking about children who would be trauma impacted. You know, very obvious, the children, you know, who would have had these experiences that, you know, we don't want you to diagnose or guess, you know, or labels.
And also, as I was saying earlier about just assuming, just if you put in a trauma sensitive practice in your room, it encompasses everyone. So what you're doing is, as I said, you may have children that don't experience any trauma, but what you're helping is promoting these internal protective factors that would help them with trauma in the future.
Every day, we prepare for the challenges ahead. But one challenge always remains: time. We plan round it, fill it, watch it, yet it never stands still. Tick, tick, tick. But with every second, scream, chase, tear. There is a smile that makes it all count.